Warning, this video contains spoilers for Morbius. Hey, what's up Morb heads, and welcome back to another epic video from Morbius Book Resources. Sorry, I just saw Morbius and it's all I can think about. As Sony Pictures and Marvel Studios' live-action Spider-Verse continues to expand, for better and for worse, it's almost a guarantee that we're gonna start seeing more and more villains pop up to fight the Webhead and his friends, even if their presence doesn't really make much sense. We've previously looked at 10 villains Spider-Man could fight next, but let's go back to that well and take a peek at 11 more villains that we could see the Wallcrawler go up against. Hot off the release of his solo film, Dr. Michael Morbius at your service, is primed and ready to tango with Spider-Man. The living vampire is one of the most iconic and legendary Marvel characters of all time. At least that's what the advertising for his movie would have you believe. And he first appeared in The Amazing Spider-Man number 101, way back in 1971. He's fought characters like Blade, Carnage, and of course, Spider-Man, and the post-credit scenes of his first cinematic adventure put him in a position where it's only a matter of time until he crosses paths with the Webhead on the big screen. Okay, sorry to detour this video so early, but I have to talk about these post-credit scenes because they are absolutely ridiculous. So the Vulture, from Spider-Man Homecoming, gets sent through one of the No Way Home portals and somehow ends up in the Morbius Venomverse, where he manages to rebuild his flight suit all on his own, and meets up with Morbius to recruit him for yet another attempt at a big screen Sinister Six. Putting aside the fact that absolutely nothing involving the Vulture's arrival to this universe makes sense, we still don't even know who the Spider-Man of this world is, which means there is a very real chance we could see Andrew Garfield or even Tobey Maguire fight vampire Jared Leto. We really are in the strangest timeline. You never should have asked Doctor Strange for that spell, Peter.
Dr. Michael Morbius at your service.
Sony really seems to be pushing Morbius as an integral part of their growing Spidey cinematic universe, so there's little doubt in my mind that we'll see him again soon. His film hasn't exactly been received very well, but Sony's probably got Jared Leto locked into some crazy 5-picture contract or something so they could make him part of the Sinister Six. Even though there's no real reason for him to want to fight Spider-Man, it seems like it's going to be happening, whether we like it or not. So buckle in, kids, for some very weird sequels. Speaking of the Sony Cinematic Spider-Verse, their next scheduled release is a solo film about the notorious villain, Kraven the Hunter. This film will reportedly also introduce us to our second entry on this list, Dmitry Smerdyakov, aka the Chameleon. He's a master of disguise who was the first major supervillain Spider-Man ever fought, and he's also Kraven's half-brother, which means we can probably expect to see Dmitry in a major role in that solo film. And considering how far back he goes with the Wallcrawler, all the way to The Amazing Spider-Man number 1 in 1963, it almost feels like it would be a disservice not to have the two eventually cross paths. Now, the Chameleon's not really a fighter. Instead, he's a master of using makeup, masks, and other special equipment to quickly and completely transform himself into a chosen subject. He can flawlessly impersonate almost anyone, and there's been several fantastic stories where he's used his skills to really get inside Spider-Man's head, including his first appearance where he impersonated Spider-Man himself. I could definitely see Chameleon being recruited as yet another member of Sony's Sinister Six during the Kraven solo movie, but there is actually another place he could show up: in the proper Marvel Cinematic Universe. In Spider-Man Far From Home, Peter and his Midtown High classmates are supervised and driven around Europe by a SHIELD agent named Dmitry. That name ring any bells? Yes, although it's never been outright confirmed, it's a very common theory that this agent is actually an early version of the Chameleon, a potential connection that's further hinted at by the fact that he works alongside the Skrulls. With this version of the character having some SHIELD training under his belt, as well as some first-hand experience with two Masters of Disguise, it wouldn't be surprising at all to see Dmitry end up switching sides and becoming a future foe for Tom Holland's Spidey. Hydro Man's one of those villains where his name says everything you need to know about him. He's a man, and he's made out of water. It's like Big Wheel. He's a guy who rides around in a big wheel. You gotta appreciate the simplicity of it all. Morris Bench was a sailor who was knocked into the ocean and exposed to radiation from an underwater generator. Of course, because this is comic books, Bench gained the ability to turn himself into, as well as control, water. He's tangled with Spider-Man numerous times over the years, but he's also frequently appeared on the lineup of the Frightful Four, a group of villains created to fight the Fantastic Four. Hydro Man's one of those villains where you can really just put him up against any superhero and it'll make sense. Like, he hates Spider-Man, sure, but more than anything, he's just a dumb guy who likes to commit crimes. Now, Far From Home did give us us a couple teases as to Hydro Man's eventual introduction into the MCU. Not only did Mysterio's drones create a fake version of the villain for him and the Webhead to fight, but there's actually a quick line from Flash Thompson later on that straight up reveals that Morris Bench exists.
There's a sailor named Morris Bench who was exposed to an experimental underwater generator and got hydro powers.
So Marvel Studios can have it both ways. If they decide they do want to introduce Hydro Man later on down the line, then boom, there we go, built-in introduction. But if they change their minds, then he can just join the Leader and Scorpion in the group of future villains whose stories will probably never get resolved. Personally though, I think a proper Hydro Man would be a great character for a future MCU Spider-Man movie. Insert the itsy bitsy spider crawling up the water spout nursery rhyme here. Hey, get your mind out of the gutter. He may not be as cool as the other guy on this list whose name starts with Mor.
It's Dr. Michael Morbius at your service.
But Morlun's still a pretty good villain. As a member of the ancient clan known as the Inheritors, Morlun's sole objective is to hunt down spider totems, beings from across the multiverse with spider-themed powers. He and his people travel from dimension to dimension, using their abilities to absorb the life force from any spider totems they encounter, and in turn increasing their own power. After centuries of near-total domination, Morlun finally met his match when he traveled to Earth 616 and fought none other than Peter Parker. Now, I've talked in previous videos about how I'm not a fan of the whole spider totem thing. I think it takes away from Peter's character and makes him much less special. And even more than that, it just feels overly complicated. However, given the fact that Sony seems to have hit the ground running with their cinematic Spider-Verse, Morlun would be a great villain to introduce thanks to his connections to the comic book Spider-Verse. He could be a foe who could pop up in both Sony's universe and the MCU, thanks to his tendency to travel between dimensions and hunt down spider totems. Listen, all I'm saying is if you're gonna have villains jump between dimensions for no reason, at least have it be a villain whose whole thing is jumping between dimensions. Not the Vulture. I mean, come on, you guys want to see Miles Morales in a live-action movie, right? Like, even though I think Into the Spider-Verse is a near-perfect film and is a perfect representation of the character, I can't lie, I would still be really interested to see how they incorporate him into the MCU. And you can't do that without including his uncle, Aaron Davis, better known as the Prowler. In the mainstream Marvel universe, the Prowler was a thief named Hobie Brown, who eventually turned good and became an ally to Spider-Man. However, in the Ultimate Universe, Aaron Davis was a dangerous criminal who used the Prowler identity to try to take down Miles soon after he had become Spider-Man. Aaron has proven to be a very popular character, in no small part thanks to his appearance in Into the Spider-Verse. And he ended up making the jump over to Earth 616 in 2018, where he even created his own version of the Sinister Six. The MCU's version of Aaron Davis has already appeared in Spider-Man Homecoming, where he was portrayed by professional Childish Gambino impersonator Donald Glover. Despite the fact that his scenes were very short, Glover definitely made the most out of his role.
You ain't never done this before, huh?
It would be a ton of fun to see him come back at some point in the future, maybe even fully suited up as the Prowler. The head honchos at Marvel Studios have made no secret of the fact that they're huge fans of Miles Morales, and even included a brief mention of him in a scene that ended up getting deleted from Homecoming.
Yeah, sorry, Miles. I'm not gonna make it.
I think Miles' eventual arrival to the MCU is pretty much a guarantee at this point, but we'll have to see just how big of a role his Uncle Aaron plays in his transformation into a hero. Okay, I'll admit, Chance is just on this list because I like him. I think he's cool, his costume looks appropriately silly, and he's got a great MO. For those of you who are not galaxy-brained like me, allow me to explain. Chance, real name Nicholas Powell, is a mercenary who first popped up in the late 80s. Instead of taking his jobs the usual way, Chance adds a little excitement into things by betting his payment on himself. If he succeeds, he gets paid. If he doesn't, he has to pay his employer. I don't know, I just think the idea of a villain who's so confident that he literally bets money on himself is really fun. Another dope thing about Chance is his armor, which basically just is a sillier looking Iron Man suit. It's bright green and yellow, and it lets him fly, shoot lasers, and do a bunch of other stuff. We all have heard the jokes about Tom Holland's Spider-Man essentially seeming like Iron Boy Jr. So why don't we actually see how he does against someone with a similar set of abilities to Iron Man? Yeah, we had a lot of Tony Stark parallels in Mysterio, but most of those ended up being illusions. I think seeing Spider-Man take down Chance using some tricks he learned from Tony would be a great way to show how far he's come since he first appeared. Plus, and I've said this before, we need more villains that just have a really good time being evil. Oh boy, let's talk about the Jackal. His real name is Miles Warren, and he's a former professor at Empire State University. During his tenure, he met Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy, and became very creepily obsessed with Gwen. After she died, Warren became a supervillain called the Jackal, and dedicated his life to creating a perfect clone of her, as well as Peter, who he blamed for her death. And thus began the Clone Saga, one of the most convoluted and controversial Spider-Man storylines of all time. Now, I would not dare to suggest that anyone should adapt the Clone Saga, because it's just too much. That's the only way to describe it. There's just way too much stuff happening in it. But there are certain elements from that storyline that you could pick and choose that would add some really cool flavor to the webhead side of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Namely, the Jackal. He's a really over-the-top, bombastic villain, and for a time it felt like Marvel was using him as their answer to the Joker. Obviously he'd have to be reined in a little bit, but I think with the right alterations he could make for a really fun foe for a future movie. Maybe he could be adapted as a former teacher of Peter's at Midtown High, who becomes obsessed with his former student thanks to still retaining his memories of Peter being Spider-Man. Because of, I don't know, some side effect of Doctor Strange's spell. Listen, if Sony doesn't care about their multiverse logic, then neither do I, alright? Professor Spencer Smythe was hired by J. Jonah Jameson to create a robot called the Spider Slayer that was intended to, well, slay Spider-Man. His first attempt on the Wallcrawler's life failed, and Smythe became obsessed with building more and more Spider Slayers, which, in turn, Spidey would always defeat. Smythe eventually succumbed to cancer brought on by the radioactive equipment he used to construct the Slayers, but his son Alistair vowed to continue his legacy, even eventually turning himself into the ultimate Spider Slayer. I honestly feel like Spencer Smythe and his robots are overdue for a big screen appearance, and with the world's memory of Spider-Man's identity having been erased from the MCU, now would be a fantastic time to introduce him. You could follow the comics pretty closely, with him being hired by J. Jonah Jameson to hunt down Spidey now that Jonah hates him more than ever after the events of No Way Home. Alternatively, you could follow the 90s animated series and have the Smythes work for the big shot criminals of New York, like Norman Osborn and the Kingpin. Either way, there's a great opportunity for some fun and creative fight scenes with Spencer Smythe's creations, and since they're robots, Spider-Man would be able to let loose and hit them as hard as he wants. That's not something we really get to see too much in the Wallcrawlers movies, so it would be a welcome change to the formula.
Back to formula.
No, that's not what I said! We've already talked a bit about Mysterio's elemental illusions from Spider-Man Far From Home, but the most powerful out of all those beasts was the Molten Man, a massive creature made out of fire and lava. Like with the rest of the elementals, there's a more humanoid version of Molten Man in the comics, and while he may not be as scary as Mysterio's illusion, he does have connections to several other Spidey foes. 1965's The Amazing Spider-Man number 28 introduced readers to Mark Raxton, the laboratory assistant of our old friend Spencer Smythe. After, you guessed it, a freak lab accident, Raxton was exposed to an experimental substance that turned his body metallic and burning hot. He became the Molten Man and fought Spider-Man, and it would later turn out that the web-slinger's old love interest Liz Allen is Mark's stepsister. Now, as we all know, the MCU's version of Liz Allen is the daughter of the Vulture, who just got sent to another universe. I think there's a very real chance we could see Mark pop up, trying to hunt down his father after his mysterious disappearance, only to somehow end up being turned into Molten Man. Maybe thanks to Spencer Smythe? I don't know, I'm brainstorming here, it could work. Man, this family, they really just can't catch a break, can they? A rose by any other name is just as evil. Or whatever it was that Shakespeare said. There have been many different people who have taken up the identity of the masked crime lord the Rose over the years, but the most iconic one has to be Richard Fisk, the son of the Kingpin. Bearing a grudge against his father for his criminal ways, Richard became the Rose as an attempt to overthrow him. For a time, he also became a gun-toting vigilante called the Blood Rose, because it was the 90s and that was just kind of what people did back then. Kingpin is now officially back in the MCU thanks to the Hawkeye Disney Plus series, though his empire has been severely diminished. If we wanted to set up Fisk as a major villain for Spider-Man moving forward, the Rose could be introduced as a mysterious new crime lord that serves as a mutual foe for both Kingpin and Spidey. Considering the fact that the older Fisk is so heavily impacted by his terrible experiences with his own father, it would be really interesting to see him try to break the cycle of trauma, something that would be made even harder by his own son being one of his biggest enemies. Honestly, that on its own would be interesting enough. You don't even need Spider-Man. The Wacky Adventures of Kingpin and the Rose, coming soon to Disney+. And now we've come to the final and possibly most controversial entry on this list. You guys remember that mysterious guy that walked down the hall of backpacks in The Amazing Spider-Man 2? Well, his name is Gustav Fiers, and he's a criminal mastermind known as the Gentleman. I won't get too far into his backstory here, especially because I've already talked about him extensively in other videos on the channel. But suffice it to say that Fiers is incredibly old, incredibly rich, and incredibly vengeful, particularly towards Spider-Man. In a trilogy of novels written by Adam Troy Castro, Fears created his own version of the Sinister Six, and this idea was adapted by Mark Webb and his team for the Amazing Spider-Man movies. Of course, that series never ended up making it past the first 2 installments, but the public's interest in those movies has recently been reignited thanks to Andrew Garfield's return in No Way Home. Should some sort of continuation of that universe happen, the return of the Gentleman is essential to wrap up some of the biggest lingering plot threads. The original actor for Fears, Michael Massey, sadly passed away a few years ago, but we never actually got a good look at his face in any of his previous appearances, so a quick recast could fix the problem. If they don't end up making any more movies with Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man, Fears could also cross over to the Venom Morbius universe and help them build the Sinister Six there. Assuming those movies aren't already in the Andrew Garfield universe, you know what, I'm done trying to figure all this stuff out. I feel like I need a nap. Well folks, thank you for checking out this video. I'm Dr. Michael Morbius, Matt Sonnack, at your service, and if you enjoyed this list, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to CBR. Oh, and also, please let me know in the comments if you have any idea about what the heck is going on with that Morbius post-credit scene.